I'm on my way up the Blue Nile Valley in Ethiopia. Because of its inaccessibility, its deep gorges, and the heat, it has been described as the last unconquered hell on Earth. Here the river has lived its life alone without any humans imposing their will on it. But now Ethiopia is building Africa's biggest dam here, sending shockwaves down the whole river. For it is this water that has for thousands of years flowed freely down to Egypt and created Egyptian civilization. The Nile has been controlled by pharaohs, Roman emperors and Turkish sultans, Napoleon, and the British Empire from Queen Victoria to Winston Churchill. Now it binds 11 countries even closer together in a common destiny they cannot escape. They must apportion the waters of the river they share. I have been studying the Nile my entire adult life. These are some of the books I've written about it. My life story, in fact, confirms the age-old saying, "He who has drunk from the Nile will always return." I have sailed the world's great rivers and examined the role of water around the globe. But no river is more legendary and controversial than the Nile. Join me on a journey from the times of the pharaohs to the present, up the world's longest river, from its outlet in the Mediterranean to its sources in the heart of Africa. I have met people who are totally dependent on the water of the Nile.
Our life is Nile.
And I've talked to those who decide how the river should flow. Right now, the struggle for power over the Nile is more dramatic and complex than ever before in history. And the Nile has been master and servant for humans for 5,000 years. The first program showed how the desert countries, Egypt and Sudan, differ from all other countries in the world. They have become more and more dependent on one resource that they had the exclusive right to a few years ago, but that they no longer control. In the second program, we went up the world's longest river, all the way to its sources in Central Africa, and saw how the countries along the White Nile are developing faster than at any other time in history, and are rebelling against Egypt and Sudan's claim to all the water in the river.
Nothing stops us now from using the waters as we wish.
In this final program, we will travel up the river from Alexandria at its mouth, through the deserts of Sudan and the mountains of Eritrea, and up the Blue Nile to Ethiopia, the Nile's water tower. Alexandria. No city has entered history in the same grand manner. It was founded by Alexander the Great 2,500 years ago. Alexandria was for centuries a global seat of learning, possessing the most famous library in world history. It was here astronomy, geometry, and mathematics first developed. The city prospered because it was a hub for trade between the extremely fertile Nile Delta and the Mediterranean cultures. Since Alexandria's foundation, its development has been shaped by the interaction and conflict between the two water systems, the Nile and the sea. Just outside Alexandria's famous seafront promenade, we can therefore delve into history. On the Mediterranean seabed are statues from Cleopatra's time, while not far away we find the remains of cities thousands of years old, almost as if the mythical Atlantis were a drowned Nile city. These monuments testify to the fact that parts of the Nile Delta have been overrun by the sea. The statues on the sea floor, just a few feet below me, point towards an uncertain future for Egypt. Because now, the relationship between sea and river is changing again. Alarming messages now come from many quarters. Alexandria is about to be swallowed by the sea. The IPCC asserts that if sea levels continue to rise, Alexandria will be one of the most threatened of the world's big cities.
The future of the Delta is really scaring given the scenarios. We have some natural protection, something like sand dunes along the coast, which can protect some of the delta, and we hope it will not impact much of the area.
These defences, built along the seafront, emphasise that the threat is already very real. Egypt is thus being attacked from the sea, but now the Nile is so feeble that it is unable to defend the delta against eroding waves and rising sea levels. The main problem is modern Egypt's greatest success. In 1971, the new Aswan Dam was jubilantly celebrated by Egyptians. This was the project that should transform Egypt into the Japan of Africa. The world's longest man-made lake created Egypt's national water bank. At last, the Egyptian state was master of the precondition of its very existence. The river was tamed, the country was electrified, new cities could be built in the desert, and everywhere farmers could now harvest 3 times a year, because of a vast network of canals, some large, some small, using Nile water. But success can be its own enemy. The more Nile water they use, the more the country's granary is threatened by the sea. This is the Rosetta mouth, one of the Nile's remaining outlets to the Mediterranean. I travel on what looks like a mighty flood. But the majestic river, steeped in myth, is here transformed into a pale, dirty shadow of itself, tamed and controlled by the Aswan Dam and the Egyptian government. Local fishermen say that the waterway has fewer fish and less water than before. For thousands of years, the Nile Delta has been one of the most fertile areas in the world, thanks to the water and mud that each autumn came down from the mountains of Ethiopia. It is still an extremely lush oasis, and 50 million people live here. But the Aswan Dam signalled the end to the Nile floods, and the silt was left on the bottom of the lake formed by the dam. An impotent Nile, without silt, can no longer defend a sinking delta against an ocean that is rising. Egypt is thus caught in an insoluble dilemma of its own making. The more water they take from the Nile, the greater is the threat from the ocean. In 2011, Egypt was at the center of world attention because of the violent street battles against the Mubarak regime. Water shortages and more expensive food were grievances fueling the rebellion.
You see, you have a food gap in the order of $7 billion every year because of water shortage.
The political turmoil in the country reinforces the water crisis. State management is responsible for controlling the fight against the sea and for controlling the Nile.
Any Egyptian government, you should dream and think and sleep on protecting the Nile River and think every day about every drop of water and the lives of the Egyptians.
But the authorities are now concerned with other things. Just when the street fights in Egypt are at their most violent, Ethiopia announces that it is going to build Africa's biggest dam on the Blue Nile.
Ethiopia will officially launch the construction of its biggest dam tomorrow, April 2nd, 2011. Senior government officials, including Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, are expected to attend the launching ceremony.
It takes time for the new rulers in Cairo to agree on a firm reaction. The Muslim Brotherhood government seems indecisive.
I assure you that all options to deal with this are on the table. We stressed tens of times that Egyptians with their revolution came with a message of peace to this world. We are not callers for war, but we never accept a threat on our security, whether in water or anywhere else. If the Nile River's water decreases by a single drop, then our blood is the alternative.
At the very moment when the diplomatic conflict between Ethiopia and Egypt is at its most tense, Aida is staged in Cairo Opera House. Verdi's famous opera was commissioned by the Khedive of Egypt. It was performed for the first time in 1871 here in Cairo, just before Egypt tried to conquer Ethiopia. The opera is about the love between an Egyptian military leader and an Ethiopian princess, against a backdrop of war between Egypt and Ethiopia. A 140 years later, I see the opera against the backdrop of an intense power struggle between Egypt and Ethiopia, now over the Blue Nile. The opera ends with the soldier and the princess preferring love to war. But what will Egypt and Ethiopia choose when it comes to the Nile? I'm on one of the numerous boats cruising up the Nile in Egypt. No journey has fascinated the world more than going up this river. Tourism began here in Roman times, 2,000 years ago. Modern charter tourism also started on the Nile, 150 years ago. When tourists visit the ancient temples today, they're told the same stories that the travelers were told when Cleopatra lived. When tourists cruise the Nile in a few hundred years from now, they will be told of our contemporary temples on the Nile. The giant dams that radically changed both the relationship between man and river and power relations along the Blue Nile. And they will be told of the dramatic years when Egypt considered every way of stopping Ethiopia's large dam. Sudan lies directly south of Egypt and north of the Blue Nile basin in Ethiopia. The location of the Nile decides the country's geopolitical position. For decades, Sudan stood with Egypt against Ethiopia in claiming exclusive rights to the water of the Nile. But Sudan has major plans to tame and use the Nile. And just when both countries are for the first time ruled by leaders with close ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, serious cracks are appearing in this alliance. The wedge forcing open the cracks is the Nile itself. Watershed geography has been crucial in undermining the Nile alliance between Egypt and Sudan, and their religious ties could not prevent the Nile splitting them. Sudan is mostly scorching desert. It may be several years between each time a raindrop falls. The thermometer shows 51 degrees Celsius when we find a place to camp for the night. This is one of the driest regions in the world, so here we can definitely sleep under the open sky. There is no sign of life anywhere. But in the red evening light, I can glimpse rows of treetops in the distance. Next morning, I walk down to the Nile. This thin strip of blue is the most important resource in the new Sudan. A country that currently has to import food, but aims to be the Middle East's granary. Although the river may look like the Nile does in Egypt, its character here is completely different. And this has fundamental consequences for the current Nile quest. While the Nile in Egypt is completely tamed by the government, the Nile water flow in Sudan has been determined by the rains in Ethiopia. When the rain there comes gushing down the Blue Nile every autumn, it has often created devastating floods in the desert country of Sudan.
Most of the flow comes during the flood period and very little as natural flow during the dry period.
Dams to generate power in Ethiopia will provide a more steady flow throughout the year in Sudan and will therefore solve one of the country's major problems. And that for free.
Water which is stored during the flood, part of it comes to us during the dry season, which is beneficial.
I go down to the Blue Nile where it flows past Khartoum. I have to see just one more time another natural feature that is threatening the old Nile alliance between Egypt and Sudan. This muddy water is so important that it has a fundamental impact on relations between hundreds of millions of people. For when Ethiopia builds dams, silt will no longer flow down to Sudan, so their dams will not be filled up and destroyed by soil and sand. But it is the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia that really puts the cat among the pigeons.
Have some benefits, not significant, but good benefits for Sudan. But it has all the harm to Egypt in all aspects, in all aspects.
It came as a shock to Egypt when they learned that Sudan did not support their resistance to the Renaissance Dam, but on the contrary, fully supported it. In Egypt, leading politicians accused the Sudanese of betraying them.
وإن مصر ما عندهاش إمكانيات لا طيارات ولا صواريخ والسودان مش هتسمح والموقف السوداني الحقيقة يقرف لأنه أقل بكثير جدا مما كان.
Egypt is sending a message to the entire world. Its sects are uniting against any.
When Egypt's leadership spoke about giving their blood for the Nile, they found themselves without allies, for the first time since the British established their Nile Empire.
If the Nile River's water decreases by a single drop, then our blood is the alternative.
It's a fact now that these source countries are going to do whatever they want to do about the Nile, and they are not going to listen to what is mentioned by the Egyptians and Sudanese governments about the existing rights and the historical rights. So these loud voices of those experts, Sudanese experts, they believe that Sudan should cooperate with all the Nile basin countries all together and not to take side with Egypt.
Eritrea is neighbour of both Sudan and Ethiopia. Can this country be Egypt's ally in the fight against the dam? Even though it lies on the periphery of the Nile basin, it has played an important role in Nile politics in the past.
This will impact the geopolitical.
I've been invited here to speak on the Nile's unknown role in the country's history. We talk about the background of the magnificent railway which winds its way up from the Indian Ocean to the mountains in the Horn of Africa. But the railway is not only an adventure, it is also a testimony to European colonial history and to Italy's ambitions in the Nile region. The Italians built the railway in the early 1900s. It's an engineering feat with 20 tunnels and 65 bridges and sleepers clinging to the mountainside. It was built to transport coffee, for the Horn of Africa is the birthplace of the coffee plant. The man who tells me he worked on the railway when the Italians ruled Eritrea could not know of the secret plots and plans of the colonialists for the Horn of Africa and the Nile. When Italy occupied the area in the late 1800s, they did so with London's support, because it would weaken Ethiopia. In return, the Italians promised Britain that they would not build a single dam on any of the tributaries that flowed into the Nile. Eritrea was allowed to become Italian because it was in line with the British strategy for the Nile, and because Italy accepted British dominion over the river.
Imprendibile, formidabile, che boss è il regime fascista.
But a few decades later, the Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini used Eritrea as a base for an attack on Ethiopia. He wanted to create a new Roman Empire in Africa. Mussolini's plan is to connect this railway in Eritrea to Italian Somaliland, right through Ethiopia. In 1936, the Italians crossed the border between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Mussolini has another goal in annexing Ethiopia. He wants to weaken British power at Suez. World War II is getting closer.
But the advance went on until the waters of Lake Tana, source of the Blue Nile and therefore largely of British interest, lay before them.
For the British, it is specifically who holds power over Lake Tana that is important in Ethiopia. They have long considered a plan to build a dam on the lake, the main source of the Blue Nile. It would give the world's largest cotton farm in Sudan all the water it needed. The dam would also give London a political weapon against a possible anti-British Egypt. When Italy conquered Lake Tana, they put a final end to this Nile policy. Rome could now challenge Britain's position in Egypt. The base of the last invasion of Ethiopia and the Blue Nile was thus Eritrea. The question many are asking is, will Eritrea play the same role again, but now in cooperation with Egypt? I get off the train at its terminus on the Highland Plain. It's the capital, Asmara, an Art Deco city in Africa. Mussolini gave Italian architects a free hand to create an Italian showcase. The legacy is still evident here in the streets. Eritrea became independent in the 1990s and currently follows a very independent policy. Eritrea has come into conflict with a number of neighboring countries, most recently its bloody war with Ethiopia, which ended in 2002. I will be meeting a president who rarely gives interviews, Isaias Afewerki. Afewerki is often perceived as an authoritarian and stubborn leader, and the international media describe him as a warmonger. I ask him if he really has urged Egypt to go to war against Ethiopia, as has been reported in Egyptian newspapers.
That's what makes the issue senseless, because why should you go to war against each other? On behalf of whom? And what are the benefits of going to war? That's where this rhetoric has become very fashionable. And whenever governments find it difficult to address their own domestic issues or even regional issues, they would resort to do this kind of statements.
The Eritrean president has held Eritrea outside the organized Nile Basin cooperation, but insists that countries should utilize the river for the benefit of all.
The Nile Basin and the resources of the Nile could be a source of cooperation amongst nations rather than go to conflict.
The president is a diplomat and has a plan with what he says to me. They published the interview the day after to tell the world that Eritrea is for cooperation on the Nile and that no one should believe that Eritrea will be used as a base for attacks against Ethiopia. History will not repeat itself. I fly into Ethiopia. Almost 90% of all the water in the Nile comes from here. Here in the Blue Nile Valley, it has run without human intervention for thousands of years. And the river's line in the landscape has changed just as little as the contours of the mountains against the sky. But now, Africa's largest dam is being built here. World history is being made in concrete and cement. For hundreds of years, the Ethiopians were most concerned with the river's religious importance. According to the Bible, it's a river running from paradise. The faithful flock to the Blue Nile source in the Ethiopian highlands. Under this tin roof, the water is springing out from the earth, perceived as the source of heaven and so holy that believers are not allowed to see it. In hiding, a priest taps it, and then the holy water passes from hand to hand. In mythical geography, this is therefore one of the rivers in the Garden of Eden. The river ends in Lake Tana and rushes down from here to the Sudan and Egypt. In Ethiopia, the lake was central in the Orthodox Christian Nile world. On the banks, thousands have been baptized here each year, generation after generation, in memory of Jesus' baptism, because the water in the lake is particularly sacred. Tana Kirkos Island is located a few hours by boat out in the lake. The faithful believe that Moses' stone tablet with the 10 Commandments was long hidden on this sacred island we're going to. Here, it seems as if time has stood still. The monks who live on the island dedicate their lives to God. Here, stories about Ethiopia's ability to use the Nile as a weapon against Egypt have been told for hundreds of years, and with the Virgin Mary in the leading role. Eagerly, they will show me what they insist are traces of Mary
Ethiopia,
and Jesus.
and it's Eritrea, and finger, and this one, Saint Mary legs.
So it's a footstep?
Yeah.
Footstep of Saint Mary.
Footstep.
So who did it?
Yeah.
Nature?
Nature.
God?
Yeah, God. Yeah.
The monk will also show me a picture of the boat the Virgin Mary and Jesus sailed in when they first came here.
Yeah, Saint Mary, yeah.
This is Lake Tana.
Tana.
Okay.
Even the name of Lake Tana has a Christian background. It comes from Tsiana, the old Ethiopian word for covered. It refers to the cloud that the Virgin Mary and the child Jesus, according to tradition, sailed on home from exile. the flow of the Nile was perceived as a miracle performed by the Virgin Mary. And once, when war was raging between Egypt and Ethiopia, the Virgin Mary appeared and said that God had given Ethiopia the power to stop the Nile, to punish Egypt if the Christians there were badly treated. I drive from Lake Tana through the highlands to the capital, Addis Ababa. I will be meeting the now deceased Meles Zenawi, Prime Minister of Ethiopia when the major projects for damming the Nile in Ethiopia were started, and undisputably the brain behind the country's new Nile strategy. He placed the religious intimidation policy on history's scrap heap.
Ethiopians used to threaten Egyptians that they would stop the flow of the Nile if the Egyptians, especially after the Arab invasion of Egypt, would not send the patriarchs to Ethiopia. The Ethiopians of those days didn't have any means of stopping the Nile. So the threat was more powerful than it should have been. I think the future is going to be, sooner or later, politics of rationalism and cooperation. But it will take some time before we completely discard the vestiges of the past.
For Ethiopia's leaders today, it is the economic role of the Nile that is paramount. Ethiopia is among the countries in the world that have developed most rapidly in recent decades. This has become the very symbol of Ethiopia's new and active Nile policy.
We're now looking at that junction there. So
Yes.
this is the main river.
This is the main river, and there is...
Teams of engineers are in the deep river valleys, suggesting to the government how rivers can best be utilized. The Nile is to be transformed into a truly national resource via power lines that stretch across the country to towns and villages. But the Nile is an international river, and Ethiopia cannot just do whatever it wants with it. The most important issue for the country's development is therefore the interpretation of an agreement on the Nile from 1902. Over 90% of the Nile's water comes from Ethiopia. When the British were the rulers of the Nile, they secured the rights to all this water. In 1902, they entered into an agreement with the Emperor of Ethiopia. They gave him political support, provided he promised not to do anything with the Nile in Ethiopia without the assent of the British in Khartoum and London. This agreement, more than 100 years old, is still the bone of contention between Egypt and Ethiopia.
The issue is whether we can use some of this water. The treaty does not bar us from doing so. The position of Ethiopia is that under international law, we have the right to fair and equitable utilization of the water. Hopefully we'll do so with the understanding and support and cooperation of downstream countries. But in the end, it's a question of our own survival.
Egypt believes this 1902 agreement, 1929 agreement, as well as, of course, the 1959 agreement. You see, these are international agreements, and this, according to the international law, it should be respected by all parties.
The dispute over who has the right to the Nile waters continues. And Egypt also believes that it rains so much in Ethiopia that the country doesn't really need to use the Nile. And that it rains a lot in the Ethiopian highlands is undoubtedly true. but the problem is that the rainfall is extremely unevenly distributed. I saw this some years ago when I went to the Borana region in the extreme south of the country. Large areas are without perennial rivers, and the dry season lasts 9 months. Even so, I see huge cattle herds, only surrounded by dry, brown, scorched landscape. Cattle are herded through narrow passes dug through the hills, and down to a few deep, man-made all-year wells. In the long dry season, hundreds of thousands of animals and humans must get water from these wells. This man stands at the bottom of a human chain that reaches 20 meters below ground. The air is poor. New air is taken down in the empty buckets of giraffe skin. Air down, water up, hour after hour from early morning to evening. These people literally carry in their hands the precondition for the survival of their society. They have been singing the Borana's song to the water, and at the same time they have ensured that animals and people get the water they must have. The Borana water problem cannot be solved by the Nile, but for farmers living in dry areas closer to the Nile, the demand for its water is increasing. I'm back in Addis Ababa, at a factory that makes clothing for export, and it too requires the Nile.
The power is off suddenly. We don't know where it comes after 10 minutes, 2 hours, and the whole day. We don't know. For last year, we are stop production for 108 days.
So that means that you really would need more electricity from the national grid.
Yeah. More and more. We are paying workers without work. That's why we are what you call out of the market because of this.
So that means that people will be very much in favor of more dams, more power plant.
Yeah. Definitely. More dams, more power. Yes.
In Ethiopia, people think that Egypt should be given much of the blame for previous lack of development in Ethiopia.
The Egyptians have been trying their best to stop us from carrying out projects on the Nile. There are 2 tried and tested methods that they use. The first one is to try and prevent us from accessing loans internationally. They've been very good at that. And they've been very successful at that. And they're still successful.
But then China entered the Nile scene. Because China disregarded Egypt and the West's interpretation of the colonial Nile agreements, the rules of the quest for the Nile changed. And China lends money here to water plants they themselves build. I was there when this dam, the Tekezi Dam, in the remote parts of the Ethiopian highlands, was constructed. A dam that unequivocally demonstrated that the old power relations along the Nile were changing. Prime Minister Meles gave me the second reason why he believed Egypt has responsibility for the area's backwardness.
They have tried to keep Ethiopians busy killing each other, so they don't have the time and the resources to carry out development activities. They have tried to incite conflicts between ourselves and our neighbors.
The Prime Minister of Ethiopia believed then that many of the bloody wars in the Horn of Africa were spurred on by Egypt as part of their plan to preserve their own power over the Nile. So in the midst of the uprising in Tahrir Square in 2011, when the Egyptian government does not have time to think of the Nile in Ethiopia, Ethiopia announces its secret Plan X.
Ethiopia will officially launch the construction of its biggest dam tomorrow. Documents reveal that the dam will have no equal with its water holding and power generating capacity in Africa.
This is the construction site of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Now, the plan of construction is to connect the mountain I'm in to the other side, and in the middle, there you have it, the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam.
Had the world been just, the Sudanese would have paid 30% of the cost of the dam in Ethiopia, and the Egyptians would have paid 20% of the cost of the dam in Ethiopia. But unfortunately, we are going to have to cover 100% of the cost, when 50% of the cost is going, of the benefit is going to Sudan and Egypt.
The Ethiopian view is that the dam will also benefit Sudan and Egypt. However, the construction of this dam is so controversial that not even China will lend money to the project. At this point, the government of Ethiopia takes a very unusual initiative in an Africa where the state usually has weak legitimacy. It urged Ethiopians to collect and give money to the dam so as to finance it nationally. Here Ethiopians run to raise money for the dam. In Ethiopia, the dam is celebrated as a national triumph and as the country's forward-looking symbol.
I truly believe that this dam will help the country as a whole 100%. It is named the Grand Renaissance Dam, or as I like to call it, the Ethiopian Dream.
Few Egyptians couldn't wait for an official reaction from the government on it.
In Egypt, the dam is seen as a disaster.
So now they are talking about a dam with 74 billion cubic meter capacity and 5,000 something mega. No doubt, the dam will have severe impacts on short term and long term on Egyptian populations, on Egyptian settlements, on the Egyptian political regime, on Egyptian social stability, on the Egyptian economy.
Some went even further. They said it was the country's death sentence, and politicians discussed how Egypt could stop the dam.
إذا لم تصلح الدبلوماسية ولم تنتهي هؤلاء بالدبلوماسية سنلجأ للقانون الدولي والتحكيم. إذا لم يفعل ذلك سنلجأ إلى كل الخيارات التي يمكن أن يتصورها أحد للحفاظ على أمننا المائي، لأن الأمن المائي يساوي بالنسبة لنا زي ما أقول موضوع حياة أو موت.
The fate of the Renaissance Dam will be of crucial importance for the development of Africa and the Middle East. Relations between the countries involved fluctuate between conflict and cooperation. Our journey up the Nile is over. We have depicted a world historic river and the civilizations on its shores. We are now at the beginning of a new era in the history of the Nile, an era characterized by the fact that all countries demand to use it in a more equitable manner. Ensuring that 11 countries, and soon 500 million people, have a fair access to water is a challenge that will never find a definitive solution. This is why knowledge of the river and sympathy for the various countries' situations is so important. Because this alone can save man from the river and the region from unrest and war. I'm back in Europe, in the Piazza Navona. When Bernini made the Four Rivers Fountain here 400 years ago, he blindfolded the Nile because no one then knew where its source was. Now, its sources and the river's importance are known, but nobody knows how the Nile and the quest for the Nile will shape our future. But what is certain is that the Nile will affect world politics long after Europe is no more, just as it made history long before Europe emerged.